G'day, and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, the show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. Each episode, we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who has spent time and interact with this ocean animal. Our guests range from marine biologists to underwater photographers, citizen scientists, scuba divers, and anyone with an intense passion for marine life. My name's Matt Testoni, and I'm all of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is Mary-Anne Lea, and she's a professor of behavioral ecology and a zoologist. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
No worries. So today we're going to be talking all things seals. And I've wanted to do a seal podcast for so long, so this is very exciting. But why don't you kick us off with how you got so interested and knowledgeable about seals?
Well, that's a great question, especially as I feel like I've been connected to seals for most of my life now. But I was 21 and I moved to Lutruwita, Tasmania to study New Zealand or long-nosed fur seals for my honours. And that sounds very dry. I was coming from Sydney, which is a big city. It's on the sea. There are seals near Sydney, but I can't say I remember seeing any. And, it was one of those moments in your life where it's such a big adventure, and I would hitch down on crayfishing boats to this island, to this colony of seals, which, only had 11 seal pups, but I'd be hanging out on cliffs, watching animals, catching them in ponds, weighing them. And I fell in love with them. I spent my whole career studying different kinds of seals as well as seabirds and whales and other species.
Nice. And just tell us a little bit, what was your initial research on, or why did you move to do that research? What was kind of like that catalyst?
Well, I couldn't study anything like that in Sydney, so I had to move. And I was never afraid of taking leaps and doing unusual things. So I moved my life here, and the project was looking at maternal investment in seals. So fur seals forage out at sea and they leave their pups ashore. They're called income breeders. So like a big fat seal, like an elephant seal, is a capital breeder. She can come ashore, give birth to a pup, feed her from her fat reserves for several weeks and lose a lot of weight and then go back to sea. But fur seals don't have that luxury. They're too little. And although they have a lovely furry coat, they don't have a big blubber layer. And so these pups, when they're little, they just sleep around on the shore. And I spent a lot of time sitting on a cliff watching pups do not very much. And then, as they get older, they become little explorers, exploring their environment, learning how to play, picking up all these behaviours that will be useful for them as adults. And we would look at their growth rates. We would see how long they would suckle with their mothers when they were ashore. So we would learn how long the seals were at sea, how the mother's trips varied in duration in relation to storms or time of year. We'd see how the pups grew. Yeah, so it was a maternal investment study, but I think the thing I loved about it, and I grew up reading National Geographic magazines with Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey and all these amazing women living in field huts, studying gorillas and chimpanzees. And, here I was on this cliff just watching animals every day, sleeping in a little hut with a dirt floor on an island that had a lighthouse and still had 2 lighthouse keepers back then. It was such an adventure, but also such a privilege to spend time in a wild place surrounded by animals in their natural environment.
Yeah, wow, that is such a cool start to like your research career, and like, wow. But so you mentioned just before, and I love that you mentioned this, is that there's elephant seals and they can stay ashore and feed their pups, and then there's fur seals. And this is one thing I find fascinating, but tell us a little bit about the difference between the two main kinds of seals, because we know they're marine mammals, but what's the difference between them?
Yeah, I did scoot ahead a bit, didn't I? So, seal is a very broad catch-all term. The wider term is pinniped, so that's the class of animals. And within that, we have phocids and otarids. And phocids are what we call the true seals or seals. So they're the ones without external ears, like elephant seals. And in the Northern Hemisphere, there are lots of different kinds of seals. Some of them live in ice habitats, and they're called pagophilic seals, which means they like ice. And others, like elephant seals, for example, live on the land. And then we have the otarids, which include fur seals, sea lions, and walrus as well. The fur seals have this double fur coat that keeps them warm and dry underwater. Sea lions, they have a bit of a thicker blubber layer and only one layer of fur. And walrus, as we know, have huge canine teeth. And they're really wonderful animals. Like when I did my honours degree all that time ago, I did this literature review on lactation strategies in seals, in all the different kinds of seals. And walruses are one of the few where the male actually helps raise the young. And it takes 2 years for them to raise their little walrus. And they hang out as a family on the ice floes. They feed on clams and things in the sediment. The male defends the female and the pup, hopefully from polar bears, but certainly from other walrus. And the case with most seals is that the female is mated the year before. And then when she raises her pup, she's in a big group of females with one male. That's called a polygynous mating strategy, and it means there's one male to many females. And so that could be a different male from the male that she mated with the year before. So really it is all maternal care as opposed to parental care.
Wow, so walruses, it's a one-on-one relationship?
Yes, and some ice seals actually have a one-on-one, but it's a relatively short duration. And it's usually because the environment they're breeding in is not very stable, like say sea ice in the Antarctic. It's not a very stable environment. And also there are predators. So in the Arctic we have polar bears that might come and crash into the lairs of ice seals. Or in Antarctica there might be killer whales or leopard seals moving around predating on young. And so those animals tend to have very short lactation periods. And the record holder is the hooded seal in the Arctic, and they can wean a pup in only 4 days. That's right, 4 days. And it means that their milk is essentially like really, really thick cream. It's just full of fat. Yeah.
Wow, so they just drink heaps for 4 days and then
they're on their own. They're on their own. Think about that.
How big are they when they leave? They'd be pretty small, I imagine, or?
Well, it's pretty remarkable. A lot of these animals, and obviously it depends on the size that they're born at, but they're double their size, usually more than double their size in that lactation period.
And the hooded seal has doubled its size in 4 days?
I'd say so, yeah.
Wow. That's cool. And so to go back as well to the two kinds of seal, I know one thing that kind of stands out to me is they swim differently, don't they?
They do. They have very different what we call morphology, so adaptations and like physical structure. Matt can see that I'm making like a seal. So fur seals and sea lions and walrus have very big fore flippers and very big pectoral muscles in their chest. And those big muscles are for moving the fore flippers, and that's where they get their underwater acceleration. But it also makes them much more mobile on land. And then the phocids have the thick blubber layer, as I mentioned, these big eyes, no external ears. They do have ears, just not external ones. They have a very hydrodynamic body shape, as do the fur seals, but the phocids use their hind flippers to move, and really they're using their buoyancy and other factors to help them move vertically in the water column rather than enormous propulsion.
Yeah, and do the two kinds of seals have similar like colony reproductive? I know we already spoke about one, so there's like just a pair that are raising one, but does that change with the two kinds?
Well, everything's on a bit of a spectrum from the size of the animal through to the kind of substrate that they're found on. So, for example, as I mentioned before, some of the phocids are relatively solitary on those unstable habitats. Then we have an animal like the Weddell seal, which tends to breed near tidal cracks in the Antarctic fast ice. And there you might have one male servicing a small number of females, and that's because the females need to get in and out of that tidal crack. So it's like a pinch point in the natural environment, and the male can take advantage of that. And then you have common seals up in the northern hemisphere. They're very small. And so although they're what we would loosely term capital breeders, they might do a little bit of foraging because they have such a small body size. And they're very tidal. So although they're quite common in the areas where they're found, they're not occurring in enormous numbers as we might find for, say, elephant seals, which could have... Sometimes you might have 800 females in a mega colony where multiple colonies have coalesced.
And how many males to like those 800?
Well, you might have one big beach master, as they're called. But with a colony that size, one male can't possibly hope to manage all those females. And so you will have cryptic smaller males hanging out on the periphery.
Yeah, and so with the male seals, I presume that pups are born 50% male, 50% female. Is that correct?
More or less.
And then does that mean that the males go elsewhere, or the ones that can't compete? What are they doing? If there's 800 male elephant seals, where are they?
They're pretty frustrated. So there's a lot of fantastic research that looks at fitness and selection in seals, and really you need to be big to be a successful male seal. So, and it's not uncommon as a result to see male pups which are born larger than female pups, certainly in fur seals. So they're sexually dimorphic is the terminology we use. They will feed more because they're bigger, but they will also put on more weight during the course of their pup growth. And then it's the ones that forage well and find good things to feed on and keep growing quickly that will attain a size that means that they can defend those territories against other big males. And that's not to say that the smaller males aren't having some reproductive success, but just not on probably the same scale.
Yeah, because I've heard there's lots of haul-outs where it's just male seals.
Yes, they call them bachelor colonies. And also, of course, there's the whole annual cycle. And so during the breeding period, you would expect to see adult females and males being very active. And those other age and sex classes might make themselves scarce at that time of year. And then they will come ashore later on, or as they're growing and on that cusp of becoming adults, perhaps they're hanging around and observing and having a go, although they wouldn't be successful until they're older. So after a while, you start to see these ebbs and flows and patterns in the population as different age and sex classes come and go from islands, for example, in the subantarctic.
Yeah, and because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the female seals will stay closer to their colony in general for foraging?
Well, they have what we call strong site fidelity generally. So it means that the females will tend to come back to the colony where they were born, unless that colony became full over the course of the lifetime of that female. Some fantastic work has been done up in Scotland looking at the relatedness of females in colonies of grey seals. And, it's not uncommon to find that this strong relatedness between individual females in a colony, and that's because of the site fidelity. And it's questions like this which are really hard to study because you need to be observing a particular population for a long period of time. You need to know the individuals, perhaps have some genetic samples to really understand that social structure. And I think we've made a lot of assumptions over the years about these populations, but I think what we'll find one day in the future is that the social interactions in those colonies are much more important than we've ever understood previously, and it's often because those individuals will be related, I suspect.
So strong family ties amongst all the breeding members of the colony.
Yes, but getting back to your question, in the case of, we're going back to the elephant seals all the time, those females are only ashore when they're breeding for 3 or 4 weeks. And then they're off at sea, and they'll come back ashore and they'll molt. They have a catastrophic molt and they lose their skin and hair every year. That's another 3 weeks. But the rest of the time, they're at sea, up to 2 kilometres under the surface of the ocean. They're a deep sea creature that comes onto the land to breed. And that's something we haven't really talked about, is the amphibious nature of seals and the adaptations they have to be able to exist in the air and in our world as well as at depth.
Yeah, well, talk us through some of these cool adaptations.
We talked about a few of them, these big eyes, the hydrodynamic body shape, fur and blubber to keep them warm. Elephant seals dive to great depth, but they expel all the air from their lungs before they dive. So they have this collapsible rib cage because they experience such great pressure underwater. They have these whiskers that they use to detect really minute movements of current in the water column so that they can ambush their prey. Those big eyes to see perhaps phosphorescent lights, bioluminescence underwater.
They're feeding underwater with those. That's one thing I'm always amazed about. They're feeding at 2 kilometres deep.
Yeah, that's why they're there.
And what
that's right. Well, we now know that they feed on lanternfish. There are southern elephant seals and northern elephant seals in the Pacific. They're traversing very different habitats, but feeding most likely on these small oily lanternfish or myctophids, also the squid that predate on those lanternfish. Whatever it is they catch, sometimes they're also catching big benthic prey like Patagonian toothfish, other large fish that occur on the seafloor. But whatever they're feeding on, it's often at great depth in the mesopelagic zone, so somewhere around 300 to 400 metres, all the way down to 2 kilometres.
Wow.
It's dark. It's very dark.
Yeah. And I mean, talking about depth, and they obviously come back up to breathe, but how do they manage things like the bends, which we would get if we did that?
Well, by expelling all the air from their lungs before they dive, so that helps them avoid nitrogen narcosis. And then they have these adaptations where they have myoglobin in their muscles that can absorb a lot of oxygen. So they have black muscles. So they're holding a lot of oxygen in their muscle. They can shut off the blood supply to their extremities. It's just minimal blood supply to the extremities and service the core organs while they dive. And so that minimizes their oxygen usage, slows their metabolism underwater. And then also they lower their heart rate. So actually a long time ago now, we put heart rate loggers on elephant seals from Macquarie Island. We could see that the females would decrease their heart rate down to only 25 beats a minute when they were diving. And then when they come to the surface to breathe, it's shooting up way over 100. And if you watch an elephant seal when they're sleeping on land, they go into sleep apnea, which is like a dive response on land. They're not breathing. And so if you look at their heart rate while they're sleeping, you're essentially observing what they do underwater when they're foraging. And I've watched, an enormous 3,000 kilo elephant seal asleep, just from you to me away. And I can see his enormous heart beating while he's sleeping, and only 8 beats a minute, So that's how they conserve their oxygen. And so a 2 kilometre dive might be 2 hours long.
So you said black muscles. Are they does that mean their muscles are actually black in colour?
Yes, they're black.
Wow.
Same for king penguins. So
Yeah.
these species that are highly adapted to diving to great depths.
Wow, that's just an amazing fact. I feel like, you look up seal facts and you never see that seals can have black muscles.
Well, no, that's right. I mean, we only learn that from conducting necropsies, and
Yeah.
fascinating way of getting to understand their anatomy.
Yeah, and so you just mentioned that you were a couple of meters from a huge 3-ton sleeping elephant seal. I mean, how does that feel, or what does the seal think of you when you're there, or are you out of there before it wakes up?
Elephant seals aren't the fastest animals, luckily. And, I've anaesthetized and captured a lot of elephant seals over the years. And, lucky for me, they're not particularly fast. A lot of the animals we're studying are in places where they're not coming into contact with humans often, and I think it's fair to say that many of the animals I've worked with over my life have maybe never seen a human before. And so they're just generally curious, and it takes them a while to take you in, and usually there's some kind of a delayed surprise reaction. They're a bit more aggressive during the breeding season and much faster. You'd be surprised to know that a 3-ton elephant seal male, when he's motivated to travel quickly across a colony to fend off another male, can actually become airborne. I've seen the whole body lift off the ground only for, a second, but, so they can do that over short distances. But what were we talking about?
We're just talking about what it's like being near one of these animals.
Yeah, so I mean, they sleep a lot when they're ashore, and so you have the opportunity to sit quietly and observe them doing their thing. We talked about fur seals and sea lions. They're much more mobile on land. They have much sharper teeth. You tend to be a bit more circumspect when you're around fur seals and sea lions. They're much more aggressive in general. But all of these animals are also highly curious, especially the younger age classes. So on many occasions I've had 3 to 4 year old fur seals and sea lions come right up to me. They take my notebook out of my hand, or investigate the net that you're catching animals with, or come and sleep beside you. Sometimes they come and lie on you. I've had newly weaned elephant seal pups just make their way across the whole beach to come and fall asleep in your lap. These are the magical moments of studying wildlife.
Yeah. So I have to ask, what has been like one or two of your favorite seal experiences, or like most memorable experiences where you've been like, whoa?
God, there's so many. I'm so fortunate. I've seen a Stellar sea lion animal taken out by a killer whale.
Whoa.
Yep. And, it's not pretty. It takes quite a while. We're talking like an hour or so as the killer whales play with it and tire it out. That's a pretty violent example. In Antarctica, I've been in a zodiac, on several occasions, seen leopard seals up close, when they're really in their natural environment, the big females. The females are bigger than the males with some of these ice-loving phocids. And a bit like in Africa in the terrestrial environment, you lock eyes with a leopard seal in the water and you really feel like you're part of the food web. I can remember saying to a bunch of passengers in this Zodiac, okay, everyone, I'd like you to bring your arms in, because you can just see this animal is thinking like a predator. Well, they are a supreme predator. But otherwise, just these fantastic moments watching animals play. They're very playful animals, and that's how they learn about their environment and reinforce their social skills. I think because of their foraging strategies, they're often nocturnal. Certainly fur seals are nocturnal. And so when they're hauled out during the day, they've got time on their hands. They've probably got a full tummy. They're up for a bit of fun, usually. Sometimes that involves us. Yeah.
Cool. And so I have to ask quickly, leopard seals, you've been in the water with leopard seals?
No.
Or just on the shore?
No, I've been in small boats with leopard seals around.
Yeah, and you can just sense that they are like watching you, or how does it feel to be close to a crazy predator?
They're curious. So they're coming around, they're investigating the boat that you're in. They're lifting their head out of the water and looking at you in the eye. So they're actually checking you out. And that's true of most seals, actually. Everyone's seen seals coming around tourist boats or fishing boats ashore. They've got good eyesight. They tend to come and check you out.
Mm. And so we talk about like seals foraging for food a lot, but are leopard seals, they're more hunters than foragers. Would that be correct?
Well, it's a little bit of a misconception, and, as your listeners would probably appreciate, it's pretty hard to study some of these species. So leopard seals breed on the pack ice in Antarctica in spring. Like there's hardly anyone in the Antarctic in October in that marginal ice zone. They move around widely. The few diet studies that have been done over the years have actually shown that they have a much more diverse diet than people initially thought. I think when you see leopard seals hunting on small fur seals or penguins when they're fledging or weaning, that's at a specific time in the summer, and it's quite spectacular. It's in that January, February time. The leopard seals know that there's this seasonal prey resource available and they're going for it. But at other times of the year, there aren't lots of pups and chicks available to them. And so they will feed on krill. And so actually krill is a really big part of their diet, and they have these amazing tricuspid teeth. So they can actually sieve krill in the way that a baleen whale does as well.
Wow. So sometimes of the year they're hunting penguins, other times they're just sucking out really big crustaceans out of the water column.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and some species of fish. So, they're much more eclectic than we might imagine.
Yeah.
Much more eclectic than Happy Feet would have us believe.
Oh, and so do you have any, we've spoken about a few different things of seals, but do you have any like really standout facts or things that you think that are amazing and no one knows or appreciates about seals in general?
God, so many. Surely you could have a few leading questions, Matt. Let's see. Well, some of your listeners might not know that some of the phocids or true seals sleep when they're underwater. And so there have been some great studies over the years that have shown that these seals twist and fall through the water column, and they have a very specific dive type, so you can see them drifting through the water column. And then when they reach a certain depth, they wake up and swim to the surface. Yeah, so they're sleeping underwater, and that's, they're away at sea sometimes, well, in the case of those elephant seals, 7 months of the year in one hit. So they're sleeping at sea. They are often traversing enormous distances. So I've spent a lot of time studying Antarctic fur seals, and they are only ashore, the females, breeding for 4 months of the year. So they're coming and going and feeding that pup that's growing over 4 months, and that's tightly coupled with the summer. So it's a more productive time of the year in the Southern Ocean. And then for the 8 months when they're not raising a pup, they can travel up to 16,000 kilometres across the Southern Ocean, and that's the Southern Ocean in winter. So it's a really wild environment, huge seas, strong winds, big storms, lots of mixing in the water column. These animals are only 30 to 50 kilos. Some of them are travelling down to the ice edge, feeding on krill, others are feeding on squid and fish north of the polar front. So it's only really in the last 5 to 10 years that we've started to understand the kinds of strategies that these animals have and the great distances they're travelling. And that's because we use quite a lot of biologging technology to understand where animals go, how deep they dive, what the environment is doing in the areas that they travel through. Like I mentioned before, their heart rate, sometimes that's quite hard to study.
Yeah.
Sometimes now there are some really amazing tags that can tell us about the sound of the environment that the animals are moving through, or even have like a little echo sounder that tells us about the prey field the animals are swimming through. And the challenge has always been to have tags that are small enough so we're not affecting the behaviour of the animals, because that's really important ethically, but also what's the point of studying something that you're greatly altering with the devices you're using? But then that's a trade-off between the size, often of the battery, the data storage and the price. They can be really expensive, as well as how hydrodynamic those tags are in the case of seals.
Yeah, so they can still dive and get their food and different things like that, I guess.
Yeah.
And, I have to ask, so we're tagging them and logging them and seeing where they go. How do they know where they're going? How does a seal navigate the entire Southern Ocean?
Yeah, it's a really good question as well, and there's again, quite difficult to study. Presumably some of them use celestial navigation, harder in the Southern Ocean in winter when there's a lot of cloud.
So starlight.
Starlight, yeah. There's a lot of evidence out there to show that animals can use stars for navigation. Geomagnetic fields, some animals have like magnetite in their brains and can use geomagnetic pathways. Probably weather. The prevailing weather might help animals and surface currents move in the general direction that they want to head in. Also coastlines. In a highly pelagic open ocean environment, that's not helpful. Yeah, so again, this is an area that's still wide open for study for many species. But it's a combination of, like for humans, we take a lot of this for granted. We're constantly integrating lots of information that helps us navigate, some of us better than others. And it's probably the same for seals. Some individuals would be much better at this than others, but obviously their survival depends on it. And I think in our latitudes, animals would be using coastlines and lights. They can probably sense the chemical composition of rivers. That in the water column they can taste their environment, the sea floor as well, bathymetry, so many different clues. And another really interesting fact is, and this isn't just specifically for seals, but phytoplankton, so marine algae out in the open ocean, releases something called dimethyl sulfide, which is a volatile gas that clouds are actually formed with. And it has a very specific smell. So some of your listeners might have been near a really big algal bloom, and it's this weird organic sweet kind of smell that you don't really smell anywhere else. And we now know that seabirds and seals and whales probably can detect this smell. And so although they're not eating phytoplankton, they're eating the things that eat phytoplankton. And birds also will dive down in these pelagic environments on bait balls and in other really productive environments. Seals can see the birds doing that, so that they know that if they want a good foraging opportunity, they can go to where the birds are.
Yeah, okay. It's so interesting how everything follows everything else, and then how everything is linked. Because I imagine if the seabirds then decline in number, the seals have a harder time hunting, and then that declines, and it all kind of cascades, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of trade-off between going it alone or clubbing together with your mates for a payoff that's maybe less than if you hit the jackpot on your own, but more than if you just swam around on your own and found nothing, you know? And I think some work we did on Steller sea lions actually in Southeast Alaska was fantastic. You could see groups of, up to 300 animals coming together in the daytime and foraging as one unit. And that was for this deep sea oily fish that migrates in from the open ocean up into these glacial rivers to spawn each spring. But when they first come into the estuaries, they're at 100 to 75 metres water depth. And so the animals would work together to corral those prey, and a bit like humpback whales bubble netting, so concentrating the fish. We didn't have cameras down there, so we, presumably individuals are coming in and out of that concentrated prey. And then when they start to lose their breath, they surface. And they would spend all day doing that until the fish eventually migrate up into the water column. They're called eulicon, and it's a species of fish that's also really important to the indigenous people in those areas as well, 'cause it's so oily.
Yes, I mean, it's even another link where like everything is just connected to everything else, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. And crab-eater seals in the Antarctic do a similar behaviour, but closer to the surface for krill. So they're feeding again on these relatively dispersed pelagic prey items where there's a trade-off and a payoff for individual seals to come together and cooperate.
Yeah, awesome. Well, that's kind of bringing us to the end. But just before we go quickly, if people want to see seals or they're diving with seals or something like that, what advice do you have, or what kind of things should people be thinking about when they're in a seal's environment or nearby seals?
Well, that seals are not a top predator and that there are other things that eat seals. I'm very wary around swimming with seals. The few times in my life where I've spent a long time swimming with seals, it's been in kind of rock pool environments where I know that I'm relatively safe. Yeah, I mean, you want to be able to, like with any wild animal, read their behaviour. Okay, and so you'll be able to tell when an animal's playing with you, but if you feel that an animal is aggressive, then you need to observe their need for distance. And sometimes that would mean getting out of the water. If you're being buzzed by a seal, usually a he is trying to tell you something, and I would take that warning. But, any time that you can observe seals in the wild, from my perspective at least, is a real privilege. And because they are such curious animals, you can have some really special moments watching seals. But like any wild animal, you need to give them their space. And maybe an important point to close on is that you should really never get between a seal that's hauled out on land and the ocean, because that's their escape route. And don't surround them. So really give them space, observe them from a distance. But if it's a group situation, make sure that people aren't crowding around a seal. We don't like that as humans, and certainly seals don't appreciate it. But yeah, they're incredibly curious.
Yeah, they are. And I mean, I always say, like, if you're going to interact with an animal like that, go with a guide or go on a tour where they know these things and they can help you abide by those rules of not getting in between an animal and its escape route.
Absolutely. And it's hard not to anthropomorphize, but seals, they remind us a lot of our dogs, I think. A lot of similar behaviors. And I mean, it's easy to love seals. Oh, and lastly, don't feed seals. That's a big one. You often see people feeding seals in harbour environments. And if those seals become dependent on outside food, they become more aggressive, and usually it's a one-way ticket to a not such a nice ending for that seal. So like with all wildlife, just enjoy watching their behaviour. We don't need to feed them. They know how to find their own food.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for being on the show. If anyone wants to learn more about seals or even your research, where should they go? What should they do?
Well, you can find me on X, it's called now.
Twitter/X.
Yeah, at IceTomPet, or I'm at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. My name's Mary-Anne Lea. You can track me down that way. I'm also on Instagram. Our lab is called mpred_lab. So you can learn about lots of seal and seabird stories on that handle. And yeah, if you're curious and fascinated by seal behaviour, whichever part of the world you're in, I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. You can see my photography on Instagram at Matt_Testoni_photography, on my website, www.mtunderwatermedia.com. If you've liked the show, please jump onto wherever you're listening from and review it. Give us a score. It really helps spread the word about the show. We also have a Buy Me a Coffee page, which is buymeacoffee.com/Matt Testoni, and a Patreon account, which is Patreon/Seacreatures Podcast. Coming up next time on the Seacreatures Podcast, we're going to be talking all about the weird and wonderful world of sharks in general with our awesome guest Maddie, who is a wealth of knowledge, especially around shark reproduction. So, this has been the Seacreatures Podcast. Over and out.